What is advocacy? So I'm sure many of you already know and are familiar with the term advocacy, but for a lot of folks, it can be a new concept. You know, you say advocacy and you can think of everything from Rosa Parks to making sure that the government knows that you want to keep public lands public. So advocacy, in summary, a common definition can be public support for a cause or a policy. It also is organizing to build power around an issue. But fundamentally, it helps give people ways to speak out about things that impact them. So right now, the CWA is currently leading tandem advocacy campaigns spanning 2 nations, the USA and Canada. And we are doing that to represent our members and the industry at large, to help give the industry at large and our members ways to speak out about things that impact them pertaining to the impacts of COVID-19. For USA Advocacy, we have rolled out a campaign that was live in April. For those of you who volunteered with us, thank you so much. We will obviously continue to be in touch because advocacy is an ongoing process. And these are some of the accomplishments that we were able to put out for our members throughout the month of April, and we are wrapping up our April campaign plan this week. So we wrote an open letter to Congress that is available still on our website to read if you are interested in doing so. It pushes for financial stimulus for small businesses when the stimulus packages were a hot topic. It also contains a couple of other asks that are still very relevant in terms of financial relief for small businesses, namely climbing gyms. The Pandemic Risk Insurance Act, for example, is something that's still very relevant and has not been addressed. So we've also circulated the COVID-19 relief petition, which we have well over 20,000 signatures on now. It is a version of the open letter to Congress, and is the purpose of it is to demonstrate how strong public support is for this ask. We also released an economic impact survey to our members, in which the CWA is trying to better understand through real data what has been most impactful for climbing gyms and climbing related businesses, and where there is room for us to use that data to advocate on behalf of the industry. Of course, we have an upcoming letter writing and calling campaign that'll be rolling out later today, and we'll provide more information about that at the end of this webinar. And that is something that everyone will be able to take action on right away. And then, of course, for part of the campaign plan is managing negative press. And what I mean by that, that's a 2-part question, 2-part process. The first part is making sure that the language that's being used when publications, major industry outlets are discussing climbing gyms and discussing the current situations climbing gyms are in, the language that they're using isn't harmful long-term. So I'm sure everyone's heard it. There are, jokes made sometimes, and also just actually phrases included in articles in which climbing gyms can be referred to as a petri dish of bacteria, viruses, or in even worse terms, like a cesspool. So that kind of language right now, especially, can be extremely harmful to the industry at large. It plants seeds that climbing gyms are unsanitary or to be avoided, and that's exactly the opposite messaging that we want to be going out in this delicate time where the culture at large is extremely sensitive to that kind of verbiage. The second part of managing negative press is, of course, getting ahead of it. And by that we mean working with those same publications to release articles that highlight the resiliency of the industry, that highlight the mindfulness, that highlight the innate ability of climbing gyms and climbers as a part of the practice of climbing to manage risk. So that is the kind of language that we're getting out there. And that is the summary of the USA's advocacy for the month of April. Moving on to Canada. For Canada, we are still in the early days of putting together a campaign plan. Right now, we have a team of volunteers who are identifying decision makers and decision influencers. Primarily, we are looking at folks who can influence health authorities, those kind of decision makers, so that as the language is being prepared for what climbing gyms need in terms of accommodation versus what climbing gyms can definitely do to make sure that public health and safety is at the forefront of reopening plans. We want to just make sure that there's no language included in any reopening mandates that may be hurtful accidentally or purposefully to the climbing gym and fitness sector. So we are working with the CEC task force. I know that there are probably some folks on this call who both volunteer with the CWA and represent Canada and different Canadian provinces on the CEC task force. Thank you for being here. The CEC, for our American friends who might not be familiar, it is the governing body of sport climbing in Canada. And they're a very unique and powerful partner because they have representation and connections with all of the provincial sporting organizations. So through the CEC, we're able to leverage power across all of Canada. They've been wonderful partners so far, and we are working together on developing a campaign plan. One of the first steps in that campaign plan that is likely to be released soon will probably be a letter writing push. So similar to what is going on in the USA right now, Canada will have a version of that that translates well across the northern border. And we're making sure to work with folks who are extremely well versed in Canadian politics and climbing gym operations and public policy and safety around health to make sure that the language that is used in that frames everything accurately, and that it's a strong ask and it serves the industry at large. So moving right along. Actually, maybe I can check in and see if there are any questions here. Not yet. One answered. Okay, perfect. Moving along then. Monument Sports Group. We are going to go ahead and introduce a case study hosted by Mark Grossman from Monument Sports Group. I'm sure many of you are familiar. If not familiar with Mark, you're definitely familiar with Monument Sports Group. So I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Mark, and he's going to be able to share an interesting case study with you. Mark, you ready?
I am ready.
Awesome. Thank you.
Okay. The guy in that picture looked really young, at least to me. Well, thank you, everyone. And thanks to CWA. The staff has been fantastic, great to work with. And so just props to them for having these calls on your guys' behalf. We work with other associations and we don't see nearly this level of engagement. So you're really lucky. Just want to talk about some of the things that Monument has been doing in support of the CWA and our clients specifically. And if you look at the screen, CARES Act was kind of the first thing that, we focused in on. But prior to that, our advocacy efforts were really on your behalf, on our clients' behalf, in making sure that payments were suspended and also that we were able to recognize, the big hits to revenue that all of our gyms and other climbing-related clients were experiencing. So I would say that, we've taken care of a lot of those issues, but as always, feel free to call us at any time with that. Garnet, if you don't mind, I can't see the questions because I'm on my phone, but please, anybody can interrupt me at any time, please, as I'm going along. So as far as the CARES Act is concerned, what we did from the beginning was to make sure that, state, federal representatives understood that business income insurance was not going to respond and that relief efforts to fill, the hole, the revenue hole or people being closed down, was not going to be there from an insurance perspective. In our humble opinion, the PPP program, should have allowed for more expenses to qualify, and for a longer period of time. And I know that that is currently being discussed. We know that the next relief bill that's kind of ongoing is being discussed, and we're reiterating that we hope that things like insurance premiums, and other expenses can be made part of that, so that you don't have to pick and choose between a certain percentage of payroll and other expenses. Okay, I don't know if there are any questions, but next on the screen, you'll see our efforts in insurance-related legislation. Business income coverage, as I mentioned, since 2006, every insurance policy, almost every insurance policy, I don't know of any that have it, had virus, communicable disease, airborne pathogen exclusions on all policies. So that's why the policies that you guys have, and even my sports facility in Richmond, Virginia, has had our business interruption claims denied. And, the industry is in lockstep there, and that exclusion is doing what they wanted it to do. But as far as advocacy goes, we want to take it further as the pandemic continues to, stress us all out. So what we are doing, there's just too many lawsuits out there. There's the French Laundry restaurant lawsuit. There's bills in states and other lawsuits. And you can research those on your own or talk to us about them later. But there's a lot of them ongoing. But, insurance carriers and businesses are obviously on opposite sides of the legislative efforts that are going on to try to force insurance carrier to cover claims. Business income claims are complicated even in the best of times. So even if legislation is passed, that would only be, part of a solution. So statewide, a lot of those state level discussions and bills have stalled out. Jersey was the first state, New Jersey, New York, Maryland, California followed suit, Louisiana, of course. Those have stalled out a little bit. But, we still want to fight those fights. We're doing it. Monument is an insurance agency, so, we're not an insurance company. So we represent different carriers on your behalf. So we're going to continue to go forward in those efforts. And we're going to try to do it statewide, but those have stalled out a bit. So we've shifted focus to federal level. Many of you may have heard of PREA, kind of built on the old TRIA, after September 11, the Terrorism Risk Insurance Act came into being. But there is increasing push, I guess, or pressure to create a Pandemic Risk Insurance Act. And similar versions are still being discussed. The carriers are still opposed to it because, the real question is, if they had to step up and pay claims right now, they've not collected any premiums specifically for this type of event. But what we would like to push, of course, is to see the federal government backstop this the way they did with the PPP, where they used the banks and the SBA to push the money out. So we think that insurance companies are set up to do that because of the infrastructure that they have with claims people, et cetera. Banks obviously don't know how to do it. So it has to be someone who, has some expertise in it, like like the insurance companies do. So that is our push, and that's where, we would like to see you continue to advocate, and we will give you that direction. Alexandra, any questions for me or anything this week? Or Garnet?
Let me double check for you guys.
Okay.
I don't see any questions flowing in yet. Doesn't mean they won't happen at some point.
All right, great. So I'm going to go next to general liability. This has become a bigger issue now as policies and the way that the states, I guess, mandate or oversee insurance policies. So insurance companies have to file policies in every state. But now that operators are reopening, there's become more of an urgency to address litigation concerns from customers. A lot of GL policies, general liability policies, contain the same virus type exclusions. We expect a lot of, legal debate over COVID-19 related lawsuits. But what we think is that our gym operators are going to have to follow CDC, state, and local mandated requirements for reopening protocols. So in this case, the insurance industry and businesses are really on the same page of this debate. We want to make sure that everybody is, working together. And that's why I know Garnet and CWA are, working on reopening protocols. Monument has been involved in that a lot as well. I'm going to decline that call. That was son calling in on my phone. That was interesting. But as far as the federal level is concerned, back to state. Different states are considering legislation. Utah passed a bill, but we don't know if it's been signed yet. But we are seeing more action and discussion at the federal level, beyond what's going on at the state level. And frankly, we've been surprised at the level of optimism that we hear about with legislation being passed or hopefully being passed that would provide some protection, from COVID-related liability lawsuits. I mean, we had one of our attorneys that we talked to joke about, I think it was facetious or joking, that, you should put a big sign up that says worldwide, pandemic, climate your own risk, or play soccer at your own risk. But we think that there's going to be a lot of protections from all of you. How can somebody say, I got COVID-19 at, your climbing gym or at your indoor sport facility when it could have happened, anywhere else? So we think that there's going to be a lot of protections there. Even in regular liability lawsuits, you have to prove some kind of negligence or, willful misconduct, gross negligence, blatant disregard for human life in order for any of those kind of things to make sense. So if it's not been made clear, just in closing on this, we are pressing our insurance carriers across the board and other insurance related groups like our local, insurance associations, both federal and state. We work with a variety of other associations in sport, including professional sports, who are all closed down now, in trying to help them in their reopening, but also in getting your support in the advocacy level, reaching out to legislators, state senators, using your connections. And as we explained, some legislators might be on one side of the vote, for a business income or a business interruption bill, but on the other side of the vote for general liability. So, whether it's red state, blue state, and whatever side of the aisle they're on, we're going to definitely need compromise, in reaching out to people to try to make sure that the insurance companies are utilized, are nicely pressured to step up to help with the pandemic. So with that, I will turn it back over And I did that all without taking a breath.
Amazing, Mark. We do have two questions for you now,
Okay.
and they're both in the same vein. So we have a question that is asking about if there are any updates on waiver language advice, and then building off of that, could a case be made to adjust the liability waiver to include virus verbiage?
So, yeah, same question. It's really the same answer to the nuanced question. We are working on template language more for the indoor side, soccer, basketball, baseball type facilities. In the CWA, you guys are lucky enough to have a lot of attorneys who are part of not only the board, but just a lot of climbers, happen to be a lot of attorneys that climb, which is interesting. But so what we always suggest is having your local attorney who understands state law review that waiver. You have Rep Greg, who's been coming to the summits forever, and other people in the business who have a lot of waiver experience. We'll be happy to talk to each of to you individually, whoever asks the questions, to review waiver. That's part of what we do.
Thank you, Mark. Garnet, did you want to add anything on to that?
No, I believe we have a pretty good timeline on that. I was talking with some of the other folks at Monument, and I think they're closing in on that initial language that could be used. I was going to just ask Mark to share a little bit about his experience locally in Virginia, because I know you guys have kind of successfully navigated the pathway to to making some inroads with your local legislators and task force.
Okay, part of being old, Garnet, is knowing a lot of people. So kind of taking advantage of some connections to for Chris Fox, my partner, and I to have discussions with U.S. Congress people in Virginia, and then also Senator Warner, and dealing with their small business advisory or directors. So we have almost on a weekly basis, I would say, been having calls, providing updates to them and getting status reports from them on certain bills. That's why, I mentioned in one of the slides at the end, there's a current bill that Senator Warner is pushing, Doug Jones, Bernie Sanders, and they are looking for Republican support. So far it's not been going that great as of yesterday, but they're still hopeful, kind of a phase 4 bill that will help small businesses. Recently, we've been in touch with the governor of Virginia's task force, reopening task force, because as you and I discussed, I think it's important for us to help them. They really heard the term, a lot of these politicians and they're the people that work for them are drinking from a fire hose, for lack of a better term. So I think it's up to us who know what we're doing, supposedly and hopefully in our specific areas to help them with whether it's reopening or understanding the insurance aspect. So that's what we've been doing locally. And, Virginia is supposedly going to open phase 1 on May 15 for 10 and under. It's been pushed from April 24th to May 8th to May 15. And as I said, I own an indoor sports facility, and we don't know what we're going to do yet on May 15. We're going to wait for a little bit more direction and see how testing is going.
And sorry to put you on the spot with this question, but do you have any dialogue with your local city government? One of the things I find really interesting about this whole landscape we're navigating is the hyper locality of a lot of the potential rules that people are going to have to follow. So all the way down to the city level, county level, a whole mix of different
Right.
guidances and influences.
Yeah, Virginia is not the same. All the states are different, but like Massachusetts, for instance, is very top down, from governor down. But Tennessee and some other states that I've heard of are very like county centric. So only, well, as of yesterday, we've been aware of what's been going on in Richmond specifically, but only as of yesterday did the governor say that the edicts or the rules that he has put down is the floor and can be overridden by city or locality. So that was a definite sea change for him. So that's as up to the second as we can get it. So we're going to be paying special attention to what our mayor, Richmond is a city council, a mayor and city council type government. So we'll be seeing what's going on.
Yeah. And maybe maybe it was in distant history, but maybe you could give people an idea how you made some of those initial inroads to meeting politicians and becoming friendly with them and getting that kind of influence.
Many of you can raise your hand if you think golf is boring, but both, I would say that 3 of the 4 inroads that I made were through I play golf with a guy who's he's a Democratic lobbyist, and he put me in touch with 2 U.S. Congress people and Senator Warner's office. Okay. So I used that connection. I have another friend who is an attorney and he actually is an insurance defense attorney. So he's been giving me some good intel that I can't share with anybody, obviously, on how to kind of approach insurance companies. I think on one of the other things we had, Garnet, insurance companies have moved faster than I've ever seen in my 35 years in the business. I mean, they typically are, it's kind of like the whole getting a vaccine. Usually they roll, they have to test policies and procedures and any kind of changes. But, the way that they've stepped up in, not only reducing premiums for people, suspension of payments is certainly self-serving, right? I mean, like they want to do the best they can to keep the pressure off of them because guess what? They're the ones that are not paying claims. So, they want to keep people in business. So I would say that every one of you, whether it's through climbing or whatever it is you do, know some people. Even on your climbing teams, there's always parents who, may be attorneys or lobbyists or, even politicians. So, use whatever you can is what we did. And then I had final step with the governor's task force was we saw who was listed on the task force throughout Virginia. And it really didn't have anybody. It was like one, I think, like a gym, like a Crunch Fitness or one of those kind of things. So it didn't have anybody that seemingly represented what we all do. So that was kind of the final step where I actually reached out to them to see if we could help.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, and it's definitely an interesting question on how actively to engage task forces like that are writing rules. Some people like to maybe fly under the radar or not bring any unwanted attention to their facilities, but there's a and you might speak to your thoughts about that stance versus being as actively involved as you are.
Over the years, I've been involved with the CWA now for, 7 years in the insurance program and meeting a lot of you, seeing what's been done on Jim's behalf. I just think it's better to be proactive than reactive. I've seen, the fights against being lumped in with amusement. And again, I'm not a climber, but Chris and Will Jorgensen, who you all know are, but Bill and the board over the years have done a really good job of advocating, and fighting that kind of designation for you. I just think it's better that people that know it to get out ahead of it versus someone coming at you and then you have to be reactive. It's almost like you're on the defensive. So, I think playing defense by offense, to use that metaphor, in my humble opinion, is the way to proceed.
Great.
Oh, thank you, Mark. We've got one last question that's popped up in our Q&A forum here, and it is, do you see insurance rates potentially going lower next year based on decreased 2020 revenue?
Well, absolutely. They already are lower. We don't have to wait until next year. If you're insured by us or not, it's important. Well, if you're not insured by us, certainly reach out to your agent to let them know what's going on from a revenue perspective. But Everest Insurance is the main carrier. We work with other carriers in this program, but they're our main partner, and they have stepped up with revenue reductions and premium reductions, almost immediately. And then also suspension of payments. So yeah, I don't think you have to wait till 2021 to see reductions.
And I think we all owe you a big thank you at Monument for negotiating that with Everest. Those midterm alterations, I know were a tough point to get through.
Yeah, thank you. And again, we appreciate it. But we made them realize it early, but it didn't take that much. And that's one of the things, I think a silver lining in all of this is that we've seen some humanity, whether self-serving or not. The insurance carriers did not have to be as willing to do that as they were. And we've seen it with our other programs as well. So I think it does show that, people will step up and, they do realize what's going on. But
yeah, it's kind of interesting, bring that full circle from insurance carriers to local health authorities and governments. I imagine a big part of this that's, somewhat self-serving, but also fairly humanitarian is no one wants to see businesses going under. Everyone wants you to continue being their customers, continue operating in their cities. So it's a strong point to play when you're having those discussions.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
Well,
so please, give us a call. Like I said, give us a call, email. Happy to talk to you guys to see how things are going if we haven't talked to you already.
Thank you so much, Mark, both for being an amazing support for our members and the industry at large, and also for being here today and sharing all of this wonderful information. I think that it's helping shine a light on some ways that folks can organize to advocate for themselves and their communities, forge good networking connections, as well as just keeping a finger on the pulse for what's coming up and where there's still room to push for things like potentially PREA.
You are welcome.
All right, we are going to move on to the interactive part of this webinar. So get your clicking fingers ready, everybody. Get ready to participate because we want to hear from you. Honestly, when we are going to be building the next portion of our campaign, it's going to be based a lot off of what we hear our members want. So this is your opportunity to make some noise and tell us what was most important to you. Here comes our check-in. The indoor climbing industry has obviously been facing the impacts of COVID-19 for about 2 months now. And we want to know if our member priorities have shifted, have the concerns shifted since the initial outbreak. It's clearly been a kind of a development of concerns and priorities. You should see a poll popping up on your screen in just a second, or it's already there. And at your at your earliest convenience, while we've got you here, if you wouldn't mind reading through these questions. The answers are all ranked 1 through 5, with 1 being trivial, not on my radar, I really don't care about this issue, and 5 being, please advocate for us on this. Please make sure that this is on your radar, and please make sure that the industry, gym owners, gym managers, everyone is represented on this subject. So if you wouldn't mind taking a moment to go through them, I'll walk through some of the questions and elaborate on them more. But obviously when the initial COVID-19 alarm went off, everyone thought it would last a little bit shorter than where we're at right now. It's clear, I think, at this point on a broad scale that this is going to draw out for some time. And initially, one of the things that was very urgent for everyone was state and federal financial relief efforts for small businesses. There have, of course, been some measures taken both on the state and federal levels at this point for varying states. Not all states have taken action that way. But that doesn't mean that just because something has been done, that enough has been offered. We personally feel like there are still windows of opportunity for lobbying for greater financial relief efforts, especially as the crisis unfolds. So that is what question number 1 is asking. Is that something that is still a top priority for you, or is it something that is more toward the back of your mind at this point? Question number 2 is asking about commercial rent abatement. So even though that there have been a lot of steps taken by different states and by the federal government to offer financial stimulus efforts or financial relief, commercial rent abatement isn't really a conversation that has risen to the surface in the United States. It is something that has definitely gotten more attention in Canada. I know that I think Australia is also pushing for commercial rent abatement if it has not already passed. But in the United States, it's still a fresh conversation. And I personally am interested, so is the rest of the CWA team and staff and your peers, in how much of a concern that is for you currently, because there is room for advocacy around that subject. For question number 3, insurance reform, that flows in really well with what Mark was just talking about regarding certain states passing insurance-themed legislation. Insurance carriers and offers are pivoting in order to be more accommodating during this time. And then, of course, there is PREA, which we have talked about a couple of times at this point, and it is still something that the CWA is pushing for, and it is in the letter template, actually, that will be released later today for you to use at your convenience. Question number 4 is asking about reopening best practices and or mandates. So this is asking for your concern in regards to advocacy. Obviously, we have focus groups working on reopening best practice guidance for the industry. But this question is really, is this an advocacy priority for you? Do you really want the CWA to go out there and make noise about this, reach out to health authorities, make sure that they are educated on the subject? It's kind of one of those things where Mark was sharing his opinion that a strong offense is the best defense, but there are other points of view on that subject as well, and we want to make sure that we have our finger on the pulse of what's important to our members. Question number 5 is more about a concern than a priority. So we have gotten some feedback from folks that are in different camps regarding advocacy. On one hand, there's the worry or the fear that too much advocacy can draw unwanted attention to the industry by regulatory bodies. So if we keep talking about the fact that climbing gyms need some kind of special accommodation, or climbing gyms want to open earlier because they're already adept at risk management, it can be drawing too many eyes that previously may have been unaware and not interested in pursuing regulation of climbing gyms. So that's one way that it could potentially cause concern. On the flip side of that, of course, too little advocacy it would mean that our voices aren't heard by decision makers, and that, as Mark pointed out, we would need to, as an industry, be reactive as opposed to proactive. So the concern there is that if we don't reach out to healthcare authorities, if we don't reach out to state task forces, things of that nature, perhaps our voices won't be a part of the conversation. And when mandates are rolled out, they may not be friendly to climbing gyms, whether on accident or on purpose. So I'm going to check in with Laura here, who can see how many answers we're getting.
Yeah, okay, so it looks like we've got nearly half of everyone has submitted their votes on these questions. So I'll give you guys 10 more seconds and then I'll end the poll and we'll display the answers. So get your final answers in and I'm gonna end the poll now.
Thank you, everyone. I'm really interested in seeing what the responses are. Okay, so it looks like state and federal financial relief efforts for small businesses are still top priority, which is great because the letter and calling script that we are releasing later today focuses specifically, primarily on those kind of asks. The commercial rent abatement is still a high priority, which is great because that is something that there hasn't been a lot of noise about in the US, and there's still definitely room for the CWA to do research on how we can best push for that kind of policy shift on a broad scale or on a state level. Insurance reform is medium priority, okay? So in the letter template that will go out today, there is still a push for the PRIA, the Pandemic Risk Insurance Act. And that is the only insurance-related advocacy outside of the work that Mark has been doing that the CWA is currently focused on advocacy-wide. So if there is another priority for that, we will investigate it and keep the conversation going with everyone and make sure it doesn't slip through the cracks. Reopening best practices or mandates, pretty clearly a critical priority. So it sounds like folks are definitely pushing for making sure that there are open lines of communication between health authorities, decision makers, decision influencers, and the CWA and other indoor climbing representative bodies. So we will absolutely go ahead and pursue that as a top priority for May's campaign plan. And the last two, looks like not very many folks are really worried about too much advocacy drawing unwanted attention to the industry. So we will keep going at the pace we've been going for the time being. And it seems like a medium concern is too little advocacy. So we'll keep going for now. Obviously, it'll be a bit of a different approach because it's a different subject coming up with the reopening mandates and making sure that climbing gyms and climbing gym owners' voices are represented at those tables. So this was incredibly informative. Thank you to everyone who participated. This is the kind of information that we need in order to steer this advocacy ship in the direction that our members want it to go. So thank you very much. All right, participation's not over yet. So don't wander away from your screen. We still need you. We are rolling into a discussion now. And that is going to be a space for folks to ask questions, as well as have conversations with industry peers about relevant topics. So I'm happy to post some questions. Aha, I see one that just came up. Is there an expected date the 2 Climb Smart posters the CWA is working on will be available? I'm gonna bump that question to Garnet.
Yeah, hopefully really soon. They're currently in review with folks at Monument and then also our work group that's helping us with some of the reopening questions. So yeah, as fast as we possibly can, we'll make those available to you.
All right, thank you, Garnet, and thank you for that question. I'm going to throw some questions out to get the conversation started. If you have questions that you've been sitting on, feel free to throw them into the Q&A here. But the questions that I'm about to start bumping out to the audience are ones that we're hoping you'll be willing to answer with your voices conversationally so that we can learn as much as possible in the time that we have. See something coming in chat. Okay, so What are you most concerned about as it relates to COVID and your business, particularly in areas that the CWA has influence? So one of those things that came from the survey was reopening mandates and guidance. Is there anyone who would like to elaborate on that and maybe build out what those concerns are specifically, or why those are strong concerns, so that we can get a good discussion rolling about some of these issues? All of your answers and feedback will, again, help us finesse our campaign plan for the upcoming months. We try not to build campaign plans out too far in advance, because everything is quicksand these days and it just changes so fast. But yeah, if there's anyone who is interested in speaking on what they're most concerned about as it pertains to COVID and their business, if it's related to reopening,
looks like we've got John Burkhart here.
Awesome.
John, you should be ready to speak.
Yes, hello, thank you. We're building a gym right now. With the process of building the gym started long before coronavirus, and we're looking to open in late July, early August. I think something that could be helpful in our ability to communicate with our customers, particularly, and with our community at large, is that I feel like I'm not really, my statement, I don't think it's going to come as a surprise, but that when we open and our practices that we employ, that we're able to communicate that we're doing what is supported by the most evidence and is perhaps a coherent, like the industry standard of response. So a lot of what we do to mitigate risk in our gym is we reference an industry standard. We're using spec ropes, industrial work at height equipment. We follow industry standard best practices. So I think maybe the development of a industry standard best practice response to coronavirus. Because, if you look on the Facebook climbing gym operators groups and other discussions, people are tossing a lot of ideas out there. Some of them I would argue some of them are not useful, maybe, people are just trying to come up with good ideas. And I think if there were a way to reference an industry standard best practice, that would be really helpful. So,
we hear you. Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing that. I hope it's somewhat reassuring to know that we do have focus groups working on that exact kind of framework. I don't know that it will be published as a standard, simply because we can only work with the amount of scientific information that is currently known about the coronavirus. So over time, that might change and evolve, and as such, our standard would no longer be relevant or appropriate. But I think what we are trying to produce, again, as expeditiously as possible, while maintaining accuracy and quality of the content, is guidelines, so best practices, recommendations for the current environment. And that might become a living document that evolves as we get more information on the way this virus evolves and interacts with folks and mutates. What I did glean from that we could do from an advocacy perspective is, advocacy isn't just reaching out to people in positions of power, it's also making sure that the community is well organized in representing itself. And so we could definitely develop a communication guide for gyms that once we release those best practices for the industry, we can also work on putting together guidelines or a toolkit on how to communicate those best practices to your gym members, so that gyms aren't reaching for that language and trying to find a way to translate this dense information into something that gym climbers are interested in reading in a brief email. We can definitely work, especially with Laura, our marketing guru here, on putting together a toolkit that makes that kind of communication about those best practices something that's easy to translate to gym members. I've made a note of that here. All right, more questions. Okay, let me pick a juicy one. All right, what do you believe is the most impactful or effective tactic to advocate for the resources that we need? So some examples of tactics that we mentioned earlier in this webinar were a letter writing and calling campaign, an open letter to Congress. Something that we didn't mention but has been done is leveraging network connections, kind of like what Mark was talking about. So that's not something that is very public when we do that. It's more behind the scenes, but we are leveraging our member network and the connections that those members have to make sure that where those conversations can be initiated at the state level, those conversations are being had. So those are some examples of tactics. And I'm curious to hear from our members if there is a tactic that resonates really significantly with you that you think is more influential than others in this particular arena, something that you'd want to see the CWA do in the next month. Does anyone have any thoughts or recommendations in that regard? If not, that's okay. And I can take this opportunity also to make a little plug for a tactic myself, which is something that you can do outside of CWA support, something that you can do on your own. And we will provide instructions and guidance on how to do that later today. But calling legislators is one of the most powerful ways that you can advocate for yourself and for a cause. It is more impactful than snail mail, than social media, than a petition, because calling scares legislators a little bit. It shows that you are willing to initiate a conversation, which is a little bit scary for most of the population to pick up the phone and call an elected official. But it shows that you're willing to initiate a conversation. You are not afraid to speak out about the cause that you are committed to, and that it's likely your vote will be tied to that result because you went out of your way to make a call that's probably a little bit uncomfortable. So that's a tactic that I'd like to recommend. And we will be providing guidance on how to call your legislator and how to make that a comfortable experience for yourself later today. I think we've got some chats coming in here. Is this webinar scheduled for longer than an hour? It is not. But so it looks like we've hit time. But let me check in with Laura and Garnet. Laura, Garnet, do you want to go for maybe another 5 minutes or so just to allow a little bit more discussion, or do you think that we are ready to wrap it up for the time being?
I think we could wrap it up. Let's go through the info about the calling campaign that we're launching later today, and then we can wrap it up.
All right. Wrapping it up, everyone, thank you so much again for joining us. For the take action that I mentioned a couple of times throughout this webinar, that step is the letter writing and calling campaign. Just to be clear for any Canadians joining us on the call, this is specifically for US members or participants. So the letter is versioned for US advocacy needs, but we are working on creating a similar version of this that translates well in Canada. So for the letter writing and calling campaign, please keep an eye on your inboxes, a letter template that's fully written out with highlighted blank spaces for you to flow in your relevant information, your state senator information. Will be hitting your email inbox later this afternoon. In addition, it will have links on where you can find your elected officials because not everyone knows who those are, and that's totally normal and okay. It's very easily accessible information, so it won't take a lot of digging. There's also links on how to find those individuals' contact information so that you can actually send a hard copy snail mail letter to their office. In addition, and it's the step that I'd like to encourage you to take if you're feeling like being a little bit brave, please try to contact your elected officials on the subject of your interest through a phone call. We're including instructions on how to do that. There's even 2 example call scripts that you can lift and use word for word, pretty much just switch out your name and your zip code, and you can roll with those. The last words of caution I have on that is if you are going to call a legislator, please only call someone who represents you. So you might be really motivated and want to talk to Nancy Pelosi, but if you do not live in her district, your call will be ignored, and it will be creating a backlog for callers who are actually constituents of her district. So focus on the folks who represent you. We'll send out links in order to find that information. Someone just mentioned in the chat, in case you haven't seen, that several Congress people have fireside chats, and that's definitely something to investigate if that is someone who represents you. You could probably Google that information once you find your local elected representatives. And the other word of caution I have is to keep it really short, because the way these calls make an impact is the subject you're calling about gets tallied. It won't be a rolling conversation. There will be much less participation than was asked for in this webinar. So it should be easy breezy, no problem at all, succinct and to the point. So thank you again so much for joining us today. I hope that you learned something. I hope that you feel comforted and confident in the fact that your trade organization is advocating on your behalf in every way that we can. And we really appreciate you taking the time to give us feedback on how we can continue to represent you in a way that serves you best. So thank you very much.